All right, so next up, we have Natalie Kupperman, assistant professor in the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia. Natalie is trained as a certified athletic trainer and applied sports science researcher, working across problems in data science, sports medicine, experience working with athletes and clinicians, working with teams at UVA. Prior to joining faculty at UVA, she previously spent years at Northwestern University, completed doctoral training at UVA, and then also holds a PhD in education, kinesiology, sports medicine, master's education, athletic training from the University of Virginia, and a BS in athletic training from the University of Wisconsin La Crosse. So let's welcome Natalie as we get switched over here.
Great. Is it working okay? Excellent. Okay, well, thank you for that introduction. It's been great to hear these first two talks. And I think you guys will see some relationships between what I'll be talking about and what Amanda just talked about with injury a bit. I come at this from a little different angle from what a lot of people in this room are thinking about. Like Ron said, I am trained in sports medicine. That is my primary discipline. Shh, don't tell the data science faculty. They're well aware. I did a talk to the faculty there a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, the hardest part about joining your all's faculty is that no one collects their own data. And I come from this world where we collect all of our own data. So anyways, well, I'm talking about athlete biometrics. And so when we're talking about biometrics, we're talking more about things that are collected off the area of play. So we collect these things on the court, but we also collect them in practice and in the weight room, and then also continuously for athletes. And this is a really important distinction in how this data can be used, right? So if we have metrics that are collected on the court when a game is in play, there's an audience present. That means that that is public domain, right? So you guys can take your notebooks, right? And you guys can track stats and you can use that data. When we are collecting things in practice and in the weight room, that is not public domain data. How that data is brokered matters a lot on what sport you're in and at what level you're at. So for the big pro teams, especially the men's teams, this data is often brokered in the collective bargaining agreements. When you get to the team level, it differs a little bit, but at the league, there's usually a lot of protection there in those agreements. The women's professional teams, it's there, it's less robust, and in college we really see none of it. This really lands at the institution level, and this is where I spend a lot of my time when I'm not actually collecting data with athletes and applying sports science type methods. I give this version of this talk quite a bit right now. It's a bit of a broccoli talk. Nobody really wants to have to think about it because we all just want data, but everyone needs to be thinking about it, especially if you're gonna think about the college realm. I think we're gonna see a lot of changes given NIL and the settling of the lawsuit. But if you're working in women's sports, this is particularly important in pro sports too. And I think we'll continue to see changes at the pro levels, especially when collective bargaining agreements are open. So regardless of where you sit on the analytics spectrum, if you're in the weight room or if you're in the front office, I think this is all really important things to think about, especially when you're like, oh, if I just had heart rate, my model would be perfect. We really need to think about what's the implications of you having a heart rate metric, which may or may not be HIPAA protected. Okay, so while we're talking, I want everyone to just kind of in the back of their mind, kind of try to put yourself in the mind of an athlete, someone who's performing. Maybe they are a high-level college athlete with pro hopes in which they could be making millions of dollars in contracts if they're not already in college now. So really we're thinking about how much data should an athlete have to give up to perform at their best. And so these biometric technologies that have really come onto the scene since about 2015 in sports in America, and now you have to add in some of this AI context, They promise precision and performance, but we're also seeing that they expose new vulnerabilities around privacy, autonomy, and equity. And so this is the thesis of this talk. We'll talk first about some of the biometric technologies, and then we'll talk a little bit about frameworks around privacy, autonomy, and equity. So the rise of biometrics. I shouldn't say recently, it was like over a year ago now, it was at a conference at the Smithsonian on sports innovation. Like, what have we done that's so revolutionary in sports? The Lemonson Center had just put out a new like innovation in sports collection. And I can't remember exactly what university he was at. PhD student gave a talk. And he had all these pictures of Major League Baseball, like in the 1920s, 1930s, collecting all this data on like batter swing and this stuff. And I'm like, I was like melting in my seat. I'm like, we're doing nothing different. We just have better computers. But they were really trying to capture a lot of the same things we're capturing now. Technology has really just changed, but the questions have really persisted over time. And even before that, we've been tracking athletes' biometrics since the Greeks held their first Olympics. But the biometrics that I'm talking about really started to take rise in sport around 2015. It really started in Australia and kind of came over to the States from there. One that's probably the most common and the cheapest one are heart rate monitors. We see this in all kinds of sports. The one that really started to change how we think about player tracking on the court is GPS, LPS, IMUs. So GPS, LPS are going to give you that location on the court or field or pitch. IMUs are going to give you a sense of acceleration, change of direction. They have, depending on what systems you have, now there's LiDAR systems, is going to how much precision that these give you, and they either, the IMUs are giving you more of like a kinetic view where the GPS, depending on if you're outside or inside, there's a lot of, I can give a whole talk on the differences between these, are gonna give you more of a spatial awareness, which is nice to have both. The ones that I really think about a lot in my work in this context, thinking about privacy and autonomy, are these continuous physiologic wearables. We've now been seeing more of like these glucose monitors. They originally came out innovation for diabetes. We now see athletes wear them to try to figure out and do nutrition, whether they want to be wearing them or whether someone's telling them to wear them is another question. Oura rings are super popular. I'm sure a lot of people just put their hands up like, I got one on too. They track things like heart rate, and from heart rate, we get HRV, we get basal body temperature, oxygen, you name it, it's collecting sensors 24/7 or whenever the ring is on. And it's sorry, it's kind of dark on the screen here, but that's a Whoop band. It's collecting similar measures to the Oura, it came out before the Oura. It's collecting on a different part of the body, so the wrist or the arm versus the Oura is on the finger. So these are a lot of the things that I study, I use, I collect data with them, with athletes, but they're also the ones I am the most concerned about, especially when they're used outside of the purview of medical staff. And now we have computer vision. My lab is doing a lot with computer vision. I'm sure many of you sit in labs that are doing a lot with computer vision. It's great technology. I love what we can do with it. It's also a little more concerning in the realm of consenting, which I will talk about on the next slide, I believe. But from computer vision, we can take video, iPhone video, really bad iPhone video, and be able to at least somewhat identify a human skeleton. The precision of that skeleton varies widely on our camera angle and pixels, or cameras, really. But it is really what we've been seeing it rise, and we're seeing it rise even faster as we've gotten better at things like being able to do monocular computer vision. We're seeing it everywhere, and a lot of startup companies around it. So as our data volume grows, so does our questions of who owns it, which we've talked about a little bit with collective bargaining, how it's used, and what questions it's answering. So we talk about who owns the data. This varies also. Now we're talking about American law versus like European Union law. So we're going to stay in America. EU has a whole other set of rules on data ownership around this type of thing. The question of who owns it in American sports is still one that is a little bit up in the air from what I understand when I talk to the lawyers that I write papers with and some of the law reviews that have come out. I think eventually it will be settled more. The next is how it's being used. So when we are collecting it in the clinic, if I'm working now with my athletic trainer hat on, I'm collecting someone's heart rate because I'm concerned about arrhythmia. Maybe they have a family history of hypertrophic cardiac myopathy. That's very different. I'm using it for a very clinical purpose than if I'm tracking somebody's heart rate to see how hard they're working on the court. I can't tell you the amount of coaches' offices that I will sit in or consult in. They're like, I just want to know how hard my players are working. And I'm like, you have eyes. Like you're a coach. Like I can tell you. Like why do you need heart rate? What is our underlying physiology that you think heart rate is what's going to solve it? And often then you start like asking these questions, and it's questions of like, well, there's this one player, and I'm like, not here to nail down like your issues with one player and your perceived lack of them performing. And we laugh, and I'm laughing now, but these are real conversations that happen all the time in sports. And it's questions that as the data scientists, as the statisticians, as the sports scientists in the room, we have a lot of ownership in helping direct those conversations and having really ethical use of data. The example I talk about a lot is, especially with the heart rate, is Texas Tech. Women's basketball, oh man, was it 2018, 2019-ish? They were wearing heart rate monitors during games. And then the head coach, she would look at the data after practice. And if players weren't meeting certain heart rate thresholds, they were punished both physically with conditioning and verbally berated in front of the team for this. When the case was found out about, the really courageous players came forward to report her. It was some of the thresholds came out of the heart rates she wanted these players to hit, and like, physiologically did not make sense for the sport of basketball. Like you would never keep your heart rate that high in a game of basketball, and if you are, like we need to get you medical attention, right? So there are these things happen, and we need to be aware of it. And like, then there's the question of why did the coach have the heart rate data? At UVA, with the teams I work with, we make sure there's very strong barriers between that type of data and the coach. Like I've just never found a really good reason on why a head coach needs heart rate data. If someone in here has a great example, I'd love to hear it, but I've yet to find one in like my understanding of physiology in sport. The strength coach, maybe, the conditioning coach, those people need heart rate data sometimes. And then, so that's how it's used, and then what questions it's answering. And this kind of goes to the how it's used. But I've seen more and more, and you guys have seen it, and maybe you've done it yourself. You get a really cool data set, and there's a really cool new model out, and you're like, I'm just gonna throw this data in, see what happens. It's gonna be great. It's next revolution. I'm gonna find the missing thing that everyone else is missing. But we're not answering a question. We're just playing with a tool. And I think that's where we can also, there is some novelty to that and exploration and learning and practicing, but in the context of people's livelihood, remember these are athletes making money, we have to really think about what is the question we're answering and what are the analytics that we're doing behind it to answer that question. Students in my lab and myself, anyone who works around the data that I have, every time we do an analysis, it can be a t-test. We submit an analysis plan. Here's my question. Here's the backing on why I have this question. Here's why I want it answered. I mean, it can be 2 papers, and then here's the stats, the data science method, the computer science method that I'm going to employ. And here's why I think this is the right one. It really helps all of us check each other to make sure we're not just trying things to try things when we're really working with coaches to help them make decisions, okay? In the classroom, when we're just trying things, there's a time and place for that, especially on public data. But when we're working with this super intimate biometric data, I always want to make sure we have a plan. And I invite people who are doing this to do a similar thing, if not on paper and with a lab, but like in your head as you're going along. So what are the current tensions in this space? I've mentioned consent and autonomy a few times. Every athlete has a choice on whether to put a wearable on, right? Which brings us down to implicit and explicit consent. So there is an implicit consent over the NBA saying we're gonna wear Connexon IMUs, everyone's gonna wear them, the athlete puts it on, they are implicitly consenting to that process, where an explicit consent is more like, I wanna track your sleep, here's an Oura ring, you're gonna wear it all the time. And by the way, Oura ring also captures basal body temperature. I will have a good idea based on basal body temperature if you're a female athlete, if you're ovulating or having your period right now. So that is a much more explicit consenting process than here's a ring, I want you to wear it, right? It's this deep understanding for the person whose data is being collected on what the data is that's being collected, what the sensors are, and how that data can then inform people about that person's physiological processes. I hope that makes sense. And that's where we see the difference between those two consenting mechanisms. We rarely see explicit consent happen. Then we have data governance and access. Who holds the data? There's an ownership question, and there's also a where is the data held question. Teams can hold data. A lot of this is commercialized, so vendors hold data. Occasionally, the athlete could hold data. A lot of athletes collect their own data. Where is it stored? We're using a lot of cloud storage now. We also get vendor lock-in, but we also have a major issue, especially in college sports, on lack of data portability. This goes back to ownership a bit. People asking, athletes could say, well, I'm transferring, enter the portal, I'm transferring. I want to take my data and bring it to my new school so they can use that data to help. We all can go to the doctor, get an MRI, and take it for a second opinion, right? Why can't an athlete? They can actually. We just make it really challenging for them to do that. But why do we do that, right? We think there's some magical competition thing in there. But really that is that athlete's private data. They can port it if they want between schools. I've only seen this happen if like the strength coaches know each other and we can like bargain something between. It should be much easier. If this is an interesting topic to you, I'd love to talk more about how we make this work on a larger conference and institution level. And then we have commercial and institutional interests. Again, a lot of this is commercial technology, right? Teams aren't building their own IMUs. We're using catapults and Connexons and whatnot. There's a question about how those vendors use that data to inform their own algorithms, right? We've seen cases of this in our own lives. People have sued Meta, whatever, for data breaches, for using their data inappropriately. You know, it comes down to, well, your data was worth $5 in the sea of data that like someone like a Meta is collecting. The question in sports is it's a much smaller population. That data is much more valuable. So if it's then no vendor is paying the athlete directly, right? So is there a way in which if their data is being reused to make better algorithms for a company who is hopefully gonna be gaining, you know, market share? In my world, there's kind of a conflict of interest there. And how do we start to reconcile that? Which then goes into product and algorithmic design. So then that leads kind of to this question of, especially with the vendor stuff, are we collecting data for athletes or are we collecting it from them for another use that's not specifically to make that athlete a better athlete? And so there are a lot of great frameworks already out there on ethical data use and data collection. There are some coming out in sports. I think we can apply a lot of what's out there to sports. The first framework is the principles of fair data use. Transparency, this comes in alignment with consent. Athletes must understand what's being collected, why it's being collected. What are the decisions that occur based on this data? Is it going to affect playing time? Playing time affects contracts. You guys can go down the chain. It's usually not, it could just be a one and done decision-making process, but there could be long-term ramifications, and we need to really gameplay this out with athletes. I see this more and more with, so I work a lot with UVA basketball, and when draft season comes up for the NBA, scouts call. They want this information. A lot of it has biometric stuff. They're all trying. I can appreciate that they're gonna try to get it from us. But we sit with our athletes and we talk about, let's talk through how this data could be used for you and against you, and make a decision together about what's in your best interest to share and to withhold, right? But those aren't conversations that every athlete has the luxury of getting to have with somebody who truly understands what's happening with data. And of course, and then scouts trying to get it from me, and I call the scouts and I'm like, I'll give you the data if you share your algorithm. And they're like, no. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And then minimization, really only collecting what's necessary. Every day we see new tech, new things coming out. And again, it comes back to, what's the question? What are we trying to answer? And does this tech help us answer that in a better way, maybe with less data, with higher fidelity data, that type of thing. But we shouldn't just collect to have a bigger data set. There's no award for who has the biggest data set in sports that I'm aware of, unless you guys are gonna start handing one out. And then security and retention, understanding data lifespans, breach protocols. How long do we keep this data in databases for? When does that data become de-identified? When does it become publicly available? I've gotten a bit of criticism for not publishing as much as maybe I should be as a junior faculty member, but it's because I've chosen to embargo a lot of my data until a lot of the athletes who I've collected data on have decided to finish their playing careers. Because my data sets they're large, but they're few people. And you guys are all really smart. You all can figure out exactly who those people are, probably within a person, right? And then we can also look at this through a data lifecycle lens. Again, consent comes across in all of these different frameworks. Secure and limited access, the role-based methods are really important when we're storing this type of data. The clear questions, this really helps avoid misuse, and also it really gives a good paper trail, because if you're working in pro sports and there's a misuse of data, there's also a lawsuit. If you have a paper trail, it's really, really good for you. And then understanding sharing and reuse. So if we do portability between teams, athletes porting their data, understanding the governance, how we autonomize that if needed, and then the audit trails, always having a paper trail behind this type of data. As we get into responsible kind of AI and developmental for development and audits, just trying to make everything transparent by design when it comes to decision-making on biometrics. Keeping humans in the loop when it comes to medical decisions. There's a lot of startup companies who are like, no, the AI is just gonna diagnose this. I don't know, I still like having a doctor. And I think athletes also still enjoy having people who understand the sport and know them, know their bodies, have been with them for a long time. And again, more accountability when it comes to audits, especially algorithmic audits coming out of these commercialized companies. I'm speeding up a little bit because I wanna leave time for questions. I say all this, but I think there's tons of innovation that is gonna happen with biometrics. And I think when athletes can trust the system, they're gonna share more, and then innovation around athlete health and performance is gonna improve. But we're kind of in this weird era right now where we haven't fleshed out a lot of this, and so athletes, and I agree with them, are concerned about collecting and using this data because we don't know how it's gonna be used for or against them. These policy and practice examples are things I'm seeing specifically pro teams and pro leagues do. I think the college level can get better. The femtech area is one that ripe with issues right now in female sports. I have a whole paper on that one if you're interested. I'm happy to share that one. So where are we going? I mean, this is such a fun frontier to be in right now. I think AI is really going to help us with trying to really understand all these time series data that we work with. I mean, we're collecting 500, 1,000 hertz data throughout practice. It's a lot of data. I think AI is really going to help us get through that data better and maybe discover insights that were not with our current methodology. Federated learning is not new, but it's something that we are not using in sports when it comes to how do we pool data together better to understand things like how do pitching mechanics, flag injury. We're not going to share direct injury data, but through federated learning, I think there's a way we could do this. Hospital systems do it really well. If they can, I think we can. And we just have incredible athletes. And every day I walk into practices and I'm like, it's so cool that this is my job. And that these athletes, they want to be here. They're working so hard. And end of the day, no matter what technologies we have behind them, they're the ones who are really doing this really hard work to make our sport viewing lives more exciting. The key challenge, though, is making sure we keep athlete agency at the center as these ecosystems expand. And I think privacy and innovation can coexist if we design intentionally instead of trying to let the tech get out in front of our athletes. That's all I have. Thank you. It's my beautiful building.
All right. We got time for a couple questions. One right in the front.
Thanks. Great talk. Just looking at it from the standpoint of, when you want to use this type of data for advancing a model or any research you're doing, there's always the trade-off of, well, I think it'll do this. Can I have it? I wonder if you know of anybody looking into how do we generate synthetic data sets that maybe are anonymized and kind of give you that same input that you can use to prove the benefit of using it, and if you've seen anything in that area, or if that raises more questions.
We definitely talk about how can we simulate data. I think some of the issues with simulating data is we don't always know the true distributions, and so we're not always sure if the simulated data is the data that is it close enough to real life data. But I do think when we're just looking at does this model work or not, or does this addition of data help us or not, I think it is a really great place to start. Yeah.
Hi, really interesting talk, especially with the implications on femtech and the general Wild West of that. But I've personally recently been seeing a lot of articles about just biometric data and its relationship to sports betting, especially in regards to female athletes and their periods. And how we are in the age of online betting where everyone's phone is a casino, and how you navigate that specific data space.
Yeah. So I don't know why everyone is so concerned about women's and their periods. Women have been playing sports forever with periods, and they're fine. Ovulating, everything. They do it pregnant. It's crazy. I personally, any female athletes that I work with, we don't collect any of that. I just am like, again, it goes back to what do we know? And in the research, which gets super overblown, there was when women are in this stage of their reproductive cycle, they're more likely to be injured. And that data, while I don't want to criticize the people who are trying to do that work, because I also try to do some of that work, it's not good. The sample sizes are small. How we collected the data isn't great. Trying to figure out menstrual cycle phase ground truth is extremely hard. So it gets really overblown. I love the U.S. women's soccer team. They did not do us a service when they were we won because we tracked periods. I'm like, you won because you're amazing athletes. Someone just needed credit somewhere. So my biggest thing right now is keeping that on the HIPAA side as much as possible. Doctors, athletes should know what they need to know. No one else needs to know.
All right. Let's thank Dr. Kupperman as well as Dr. Glazer for great talks. And we are going to, any other questions you can feel free to ask during the break. And we're going to switch over here now for a nice little break